Morning, everybody. How we doing today? It is a Friday here in the upper Midwest. It's a snowy day. I mean, we'll take a look around and gander at the beautiful snow on the trees. I mean, it is pretty. I'll say that. But it's not super cold, but the cold's coming next week, which that's going to freeze all the snow hard, and then that's not fun. As long as you stay around freezing, the snow's pretty harmless. Here's an interesting question I get asked a lot. And I've got even some, since we opened the cafe, from beginners. Where's a great place to start with jazz? And it's a tough question to answer because it's really difficult to measure somebody else's musical acumen just from a brief introduction. You know, what are you listening to? It requires a little bit of prescience, a little knowledge of what you're into and your personality for me to really make a good recommendation. It's not the easiest thing in the world to just say, oh, you're going to love this. But listening to a record this morning, I've come up with a candidate that I think is a very noble and honorable and worthy candidate for anyone who wants to dip their toe into the waters of jazz. And partly why I think this record is such a great option is it's very accessible and clean and beautiful and luxurious. At the same time, it's got some real meat on the bone. It's got some real playing and even some hints of, I don't want to say the avant-garde, but it's got hints of the free spirit that jazz embodies. And of course, we're talking about John Coltrane with Johnny Hartman. It's truly one of my favorite records of all time. And it's probably a record that someone had asked me 10 years ago. I probably would have said, buy this first. You know, but I've kind of broadened my horizons so broad that sometimes you forget about some of the old pillars that exist in the temple. And boy, that's a pillar. That's just a fantastic session by an evolving Coltrane who, at the behest of Impulse, is doing stuff a little bit more accessible than Africa Brass and Village Vanguard. That Coltrane quartet is starting to push the envelope. It's starting to really explore the outer regions of the musical universe. And Coltrane's starting to have health issues, which I think also furthers his experimental nature, trying to discover as much of the hidden secrets of music and the power that it brings before he passes, which it's a very short journey from 63 to 67. You know what I mean? When he passes away on us. And he really definitely goes down every avenue that the musical world had to offer in a very short time. And he's already kind of started that journey here at Impulse. Impulse brings him in 60, that's when they ABC decides to launch the Impulse Jazz label. And for those of you who don't know Impulse, it was a beautiful, gatefold label. Creed Taylor was heavily involved. Creed Taylor kind of seats with Bethlehem. Went to ABC and helped record some great sessions at ABC. And then they launched Impulse, which is an extension of ABC. It's a subsidiary of ABC with the gatefold, the orange spines. And their big coup was signing Coltrane. And Coltrane was off the heels of Atlantic doing My Favorite Things, which was a big hit for a jazz song at that point. And so I think they thought they got this cash cow. But unfortunately, Coltrane's ideas were in Giant Steps and in Africa Brass and Village Vanguard again, and he was pushing the boundaries of the universe already, and he wasn't one much to be bridled. And part of his contract with Impulse was to have a fairly carte blanche control over what he was going to do. And Impulse was definitely much more accessible and easy to listen to for the most part than what Coltrane's horizons were forcing upon them. And so they kind of nudged him somewhat unwillingly, it feels like, into doing some records that were more accessible, like ballads, like the record with Duke Ellington. That's also one of my favorite records of all time. It would also be a fair choice for this, where would you start with jazz? But I think the Hartman record is even a better choice because it's got the vocals. And for a lot of people, vocals add a layer of comfort and familiarity because we come from a pop rock upbringing. So having the words in there really gives us a bearing, gives us some shape and framework that we feel comfortable with, having a chorus, verse approach, it keeps us from being too lost in the music. And what's great about this record is Hartman is one of truly the greatest singers of his era. And when they approached Coltrane about doing a record with a singer, his response was, there's only one guy I'll do a record with vocally, and that's Johnny Hartman. And he'd done some stuff at Roost. He did a record at Regent, a few other small things here and there that none of them were mainstream by any stretch of the imagination. And he was slipping into obscurity already by 62. And without this record with Coltrane, none of us probably would really remember the great Johnny Hartman like we do. But, I'm a huge fan of Hartman, and this is where I discovered him, of course. And it's a record I've listened to endlessly. And the versions of Lush Life and You Are My Son, You Are So Beautiful, My One and Only Love. They say every song on the record, really, all 6 of them are just amazing versions of those songs. And a lot of them are songs that you'll have heard Dean Martin or Tony Bennett or Frank Sinatra have done. Ella Fitzgerald may have done them. To hear Hartman do them with this great Coltrane quartet in a real jazz setting, it's really seminal versions of these songs. Honestly, they're as good a version of these songs. You'll almost be disappointed going back to the more saccharine versions of them. But what really makes this record a great place to start is Coltrane still kind of chomping at the bit. And so even though he's playing fairly within the lines, he's still pushing the boundaries and still adding extra notes because that's how he was. He was experimental. He was explosive. He was inventive. And if an idea came to him that seemed to be wonderful, he couldn't help but share it with us. And so what you end up getting is a vocal jazz record with a lot of playing on it. And when Hartman puts the mic down and Coltrane steps up to the mic, you're going to get some real deep, insightful, heartfelt playing from a giant, which you get on the Coltrane Ellington record as well. But boy, it's amazing. It's satisfying. It's delightful. It's a lot of things, this record. And it's a record I hold dear to my heart. I've played it infinite times, honestly, to the point where I kind of take it for granted. But playing it in the cafe last night, then again this morning to start things off, I'm like, what a great place to start. And so, again, it's a question I might give you a different answer the next time that someone asks me. But for right now, I would say it's hard to top this as a record that's filled with delight, accessible, got some meat on the bone, and is a wonderful place to get to know the world of jazz. You'd have a hard time finding something better. So in part 2 of today's episode, I want to talk to you about the jazz people who make a lot of these records happen, the players themselves. So many of them were so prolific, and yet have kind of slipped into the cracks and have become forgotten. And probably it's not true for any other player, the guys who played the bass or the double bass, whatever you want to call it. Those upright bass players, some of those guys were very in demand and recorded a lot of sessions. Guys like Paul Chambers, Ron Carter, Wendell Marshall. There's so Milt Hinton. There's so many guys, Oscar Pettiford, just that were on a lot of people's records. If you were a good Sam Jones, if you were a good bass player, you often were kind of a house musician for that label that you were associated with, and were often on infinite records. Even Charlie Mingus at a young age was pretty prolific as a sideman, showing up in a lot of different recordings that you wouldn't think of as necessarily Mingus style recordings. And I'm making my trading cards again. I'm back at it. I'm up to like 530 now. And we're going to go to 693, which will fill a binder up full pages nicely. It'd be a pretty cool collection of cards when all is said and done. But I was making the cards for a bass player, for a bass player of the day. And I have nearly 50 bass players in my series of cards. And so a lot of them are just like, wow, it's crazy how many records this guy was on. But here's a guy who I definitely knew, definitely recognized his face when I see it, saw his name on a lot of things, but didn't realize he was this prolific. A guy by the name of George Duvivier. And Duvivier, if I remember, was an East Coast guy. I think it was New York. And boy, his canon, his body of work is pretty amazing. It's almost Paul Chambers like. There's nothing for him as a leader, which is part of probably his obscurity. And he was kind of known for working with Bud Powell for a number of years. But again, we'll just kind of flip through this real quick just to give you some ideas here. Pepper Adams, Manny Alban, Gene Ammons, and for those of you who don't know, I had to do a new printout for him for my binders, and it's three double pages and an extension onto a page 4, and I've highlighted the stuff I have, of course. So again, Pepper Adams, Manny Alban, Joe Albany, Gene Ammons, he's on a half dozen records, some Armstrong stuff from later in his career, a number of Count Basie records, Louis Bellson, some George Benson stuff from the 70s, Bob Brookmeyer, Ruth Brown, the great blues singer at Atlantic, Ray Bryant, the great piano player, Kenny Burrell, he's on a few of his sessions, the great Benny Carter, who one of the great trumpet players, alto players of all time, Ron Carter, he's on the Where question mark on New Jazz. It's interesting George Duvivier is on that. Sonny Clark and Max Roach on Time Records, he's on that. Arnett Cobb on a few of his records. Al Cohn, he's on an infinite number of Lockjaw Davis records. Eric Dolphy, Buddy DeFranco, Art Farmer, Jimmy Forrest, Ronnie Foster, he's on an Aretha session. Bud Freeman, Stan Getz, Dizzy Gillespie. That's just page 1. Paul Gonsalves on Impulse. Honey Gordon, who's on Prestige. Gigi Grice, reminiscent on Mercury. Chico Hamilton, Roland Hanna, Wilbur Hardin, Barry Harris, Coleman Hawkins on 4 of his sessions. And these lists aren't complete. People are adding stuff to these lists on Wikipedia all the time. Johnny Hodges, Bobby Humphrey, I think I might have that record, I'm not sure. Milt Jackson, Illinois Jacquette, Bud Johnson, Etta Jones, Hank Jones, Ben E. King, the soul singer. I got a customer. So, I had a customer walk in, so I apologize for that. But, so Benny King, the soul singer, he's done some work with him on ATCO, Atlantic. John Lewis, the fantastic pianist from Modern Jazz Quartet. The great guitar player, Mundo Lowe, who worked with Bill Evans and others. Tony Scott, the clarinetist. I'm a big Mundo Lowe guy. Johnny Lytle, the great vibraphonist, who some claimed, including Lionel Hampton, that Lytle was the greatest player ever on the vibes. Junior Mance, the great pianist. Barry Manilow, believe it or not. Shelly Manne, the great drummer. Don McLean. Don McLean, America Pie. Gil Melly, how you want to say that. Wes Montgomery going on in my head. I mean, this is incredible, isn't it? Moondog, he's on one of his Columbia sessions. Jerry Mulligan, a whole bunch of Oliver Nelson work, probably 7 or 8 of those. He's on Herbie Nichols' Love, Cash, Gloom, whatever that record was called. What's it called? Yeah, Love, Gloom, Cash, got it backwards. Anita O'Day, the great singer. Chico Farrell, Jackie Paris, the great singer. Dave Pike, Houston Person, Bucky Pizzarelli, the great guitarist. Bud Powell, Freddie Red, Red Rodney, Jimmy Rushing, A.K. Salim, the great arranger, who has some fine work at Savoy. Lalo Schifrin, the Brazilian, or I think he's Argentinian actually. Gunther Schuller, the German jazz abstraction with, I think that's John Lewis on that as well. Shirley Scott, the organ player, he's on a dozen of her records. I mean, it's a pretty wide swath of musicians he's working with. The great Jimmy Smith and the great Johnny Smith. Guitar and organ there. Leon Spencer, Sonny Stitty's on a ton of his stuff. Buddy Tate, Billy Taylor, the pianist. Clark Terry, the trumpet player. Some Jay McShann, Joe Thomas stuff. Cal Jader, the vibraphonist. Again, I had a customer come in, not complaining. So again, Clark Terry, Stanley Turrentine, Cal Jader, number of his Verve sessions. Warren Vosh Jr., who I don't even know who that is, on Concord Jazz. Eddie Cleanhead Vinson, Mal Waldron, Walter Wanderley, Julius Watkins, the French horn player. And then last but not least, Chuck Wayne, that great session on Savoy, the jazz guitarist. Ben Webster, the tenor player. Frank West, the great flautist and sax player. Randy Weston. Joe Wilder, one of my favorite trumpet players. Lem Winchester, another fantastic vibraphonist. And then the great Lester Young. And so, boy, when I printed this out yesterday and was making my trading card, I was like, this guy played on a lot of stuff. It was way more than I anticipated. And I knew he had a long track record. You know, I've seen him on countless records, but I had no idea it was quite that extensive. And then he played on that. Man, that's Kenny Burrell, like that's Paul Chambers, like. So George Duvivier, he's a hidden icon. And jazz has that. Jazz has players that played for decades, that were on countless sessions, that worked in different genres and styles of the music, that were versatile and able to excel in almost any setting. And once you became a reputationable guy in terms of this guy can play bass for anybody, anytime, anyone and everyone would hire you. And good bass players were tough to find. And so again, George Duvivier, a guy that's fairly somewhat obscure, probably known for his time with Bud Powell the best. You know, but man, that's a legacy. That's a long documentation of a man's life right there. And boy, we just kind of overlook a lot of these people, you know. So that's part of what I feel my job is here as the Jazz Shepherd, is when I'm doing my research and making my trading cards and doing my printouts for my binders. Just the aha wow moments, I like to share that with you guys. And again, it's not me teaching as much as me learning and then sharing what I just learned. So that's humility. I'm not saying I know it all. I don't. I'm always being like blown away. Like, wow, this music's incredible. These men were incredible. The sacrifices and the time they put in and the effort they made, it's an incredible thing. Not to be taken lightly. And rock and roll people churn out a record once a year and we're like, wow, they're prolific. And these guys were doing dozens of sessions, sometimes far more than that, in a few months. You know, a guy like Milt Hinton, Otzi Johnson, Barry Galbraith, and Hank Jones, the great rhythm section, those guys would sometimes do 3, 4, and 5 sessions in a day. In New York, going from one studio to the next, doing a pop song, doing a jazz session, doing some commercial radio jingles. They were just in demand. A great rhythm section is tough to come by. And so, cheers to these guys. George Duvivier, my hat's off to you. You did an incredible job. Speaking of the Chuck Wayne session, I figured I'd listen to it next here in the cafe. A wonderful player who actually kind of pushed some of the envelopes of jazz and guitar. And there's books that he wrote talking about how to play and restructuring some of the math behind it. A real clever guy and a great player, playing with Zoot Sims and Brew Moore. It's a pretty tough Savoy to find, 12077. It's one of those records that you may find it for $10, but the right seller will know and it'll be $150. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. And of course, there's George Duvivier, the aforementioned. And again, Zoot Sims, Brew Moore, Harvey Leonard on the piano, Ed Shaughnessy on the drums. And the second section has the great John Mehegan on the piano, along with Vinnie Burke and Joe Morello. So it's pretty intense, quality players, beautiful old guitars out of Gibson, hard to tell. Beautiful stuff. And Zoot's doing his thing right there. Chuck's going to do his thing. We're just going to let that play. So that wraps up today's episode. Record to go to, start jazz collecting. I'd say Coltrane and Hartman's as good as a record as you can get. It'll give you some of the old school, some of the newer school, some playing with some accessibility. It's a wonderful dovetail of all elements. George Duvivier, wow, what a career. And again, these Wikipedia pages aren't complete. Stuff gets added to them all the time. Some guys are more complete than others, like Coltrane's, you know, those guys have had such documentation. But some of these more in between the crack players, I'll come back to their page a year later, and there'll be 4 more editions that people have added in there of sessions they were on. So I doubt it's complete, but it's already 7 pages long. So good for him. And then Chuck Wayne, great player. Wonderful stuff. That's today's episode. Getting back in the rhythm and making episodes, getting my excitement back, getting my exhaustion under control. I'm feeling a little more vibrant, a little bit more. The euphoria kind of carried me the first few weeks, but now I'm kind of getting my sea legs under me, getting used to the rocking of the poop deck, as they say. And again, I'm thrilled to be here, guys. I'm thrilled to be in a place where I'm sharing jazz with the common man. and showing them how accessible and wonderful and how important this music is. And I've had some people tell me, talking to large groups of women and stuff, they were just American housewives. They're coming in for tea and coffee with their friends, and we talk about the music and the history. And I've had a couple of people say it almost moved them to tears hearing me talk about some of the history. And I fetter what I say here too. I'm not going as hard as I do here on the channel sometimes. I'm saying it in a kind of a saccharine way. But again, the power of art to countermeasure time, the times that exists in. Again, that old saying, the winners of the great wars write the history books. The losers of those wars get to make great art. And that's my addition to that saying. Whether it's the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, or whether it's the songs of Motown, the blues and jazz, you put a thumb on me, I'm going to find a way to dance in spite of you. I'm going to find a way to find freedom in spite of these chains. And that human condition, that unwillingness to surrender, speaks to the human spirit. And it ministers, and if all of us can feel that. Even if we don't know what we love about it, we know that we love it. We can feel something magnetic, something compulsive about it. And again, it's that human ability to overcome that, for all of us, is a nice message to be reminded of. And again, why I love jazz so much is it doesn't allow me to ever feel sorry for myself. People going through much tougher things than I made this art. Boy, time to put my boots on and get back to work. Y'all be safe. Y'all have a great day. Appreciate and love you all. If you want to support the channel, hit the thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel, of course. Tell your friends about us. If you really want to go the next step further, go to my Patreon page and pledge $5 a month to help me out. It helps me make content, helps me buy new records. I'm still figuring out what my revenues in this cafe are going to be. It's a bit slower this week, but still, it's still solid. So again, we're thrilled to be doing all this. Much love, by my heart. Thelonious Monk loves you. Talk to you soon. Peace.